Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all here to BCU, ADM, Birmingham, and to our international lecture series and the launch of the research cluster for the West Midlands National Park Lab. So welcome, everybody. I want to welcome Andrew Grant today. Andrew is one of the most quietly confident, creative and unassuming landscape architects I've come across. I've been running this lecture series looking at the relationship between art and design and the materiality of design. And so immediately, as soon as I could, I invited Andrew to come up and talk at that lecture series, as well as to come to the studio with the students, just like he's done today. So that was the beginning of a whole series of visits to BCU. He was a regular contributor to the lecture series, which was absolutely brilliant. And his skill in expressing ideas in form through a light, tone, texture, space, the materiality of landscape is absolutely extraordinary. So we're very, very honoured for him to be here again today. Thank you so much for being here. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew to talk about his lifetime's work and achievements. Thank you very much.
It's always a great pleasure to come and be part of a sort of student world. And I hope you get something from the sort of story I'm going to tell. I've been doing this talk recently, which is basically me reflecting on my career, and it starts from when I was a student and it goes through to what I'm doing now and what I'm thinking. And it just addresses certain moments in time when things changed. You know, just coincidentally, like the Singapore project, or whether it was maybe I was thinking about what's going on in the world, politics and all those sort of things. And it's really interesting at this moment in time where we're actually faced with so many existential challenges. How do we, as a community of designers, actually address that? So just to sort of put it in context, sort of full disclosure, I'm 66 now, and I was a student back in the 70s, more or less like you guys now. And I just dug out these drawings I was doing when I was basically doing A-levels or just first year in university. And I was struck at the time that what on earth are we doing to the planet? How are we creating cities? So even at that stage, I was just exploring what is the human relationship with the built environment. I had no idea I was going to become a landscape architect at that time, I don't think. But you can see I was interested in forms, a bit of urbanity. I was interested in biodiversity. This was a time of David Attenborough, Life on Earth, first sort of series came out, and there was E.O. Wilson's book, Diversity of Life, which hugely influential books for me at those early stages. But there's parallel things in our worlds that we also get influenced by. I grew up on a farm in the sort of remote parts of East Yorkshire. So I was completely happy with the seasons and all those sort of things, you know, what happens in the general life of a farm. But then I was plugged into school with friends and got into the whole music world, and punk was absolutely at that moment. So this was me going across to Sheffield from Hull with some friends in '77. Just opened up this whole different perspective of creativity. How do you sort of get a buzz out of, different aspects of life? And I think that sort of twin thing about having grown up in nature and having an exposure to extraordinarily powerful art forms are the things that have driven me, I think, personally. There's a collection of images here, which is basically probably the first 10 years of my career after I graduated as a landscape architect. And it's a real weird mix. But it was like a sort of a learning curve, really. It's like learning business, learning the sort of the craft. I spent 3 years living in Qatar, which was complete, after being in the middle of a rural Yorkshire into Edinburgh College of Art and then thrown into Qatar, into a completely different culture. That really threw me, but it was basically an amazing experience because I got to work with incredible designers, incredible craftsmen from different parts of the world, and I got to know about materials in a way that I wouldn't have done in the UK. I came back to the UK, and this was a time of landscape impact assessment starting to really have a sort of a growth within the landscape world. In fact, most of the work was actually doing landscape impact assessments for widening motorways, or doing sort of car park layouts for Tesco's and Sainsbury's. So I did a lot of that, including, planning sort of a weird BP oil field in Poole Harbour, one of the most sensitive landscapes in the UK. How do we hide some of that infrastructure? And then doing a colour study for hiding, which was basically Windrush, which was an Atomic Energy Authority research station. How do we hide some of this infrastructure within a sort of a heathery environment? And you can see, even then, I was thinking, let's be a bit bold about this. It's not just about trying to make everything disappear all the time. It's been about using colour cleverly in that. And then also having the opportunity to do a landscape assessment of Dartmoor National Park, and which I spent 6 months basically just immersed in one of the most amazing landscapes in the UK. So there's a spectrum there of stuff that I got exposed to and I learned, which stood me in good stead ever since. But I've always wondered, I always wanted to do something more. So at some point in my career, when I was at Nicholas Pearson Associates for 10 years, I basically thought, I'm going to do something different. So I wrote to Geoffrey Jellicoe, and I actually came to a talk that Catherine had organised, a conference where Geoffrey Jellicoe spoke. And I can't remember whether this was before or after, I can't remember. But anyway, I wrote to him, and I said, can I come and see you? And he invited me to go and see him at his house in High Point. So Geoffrey Jellicoe, if you don't know, was basically a very eminent landscape architect. He inspired lots of things. He did beautiful drawings, and he was a very gentle soul and a very lovely man. And I went to see him in his High Point. There's a sort of very modernist building in London. And I'll never forget that experience, because basically on one wall, he had a collection of 20th century artworks, originals, from Ben Nicholson, Graham Sutherland, Picasso, all sorts of people like that. Literally just a wall like this. And that's where he worked. That was his electricity. And on the other side, just windowsill, there was this little collection of pottery cats and dogs. It's really weird juxtaposition. But I loved it. So I haven't quite got the collection of 20th century art, but I've got a collection of plastic animals and some quite interesting prints. Anyway, he wrote this letter back to me, if you can read it. I think your drawings are stunning, and that's all I needed to sort of hear. So it inspired me to say, okay, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to set up my own practice. And that also came at a time when the emergence of the concept of sustainable development was really starting to take root. It's the Rio conference in 1992, where Agenda 21 came into play. And basically, there was a lot of very sensible analysis of what the world needed to do. And lots of ideas thinking this is how we need to do it. And if all of that had been actioned, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today. And I think, but what was fantastic at that time, it was that energy of creativity. There was lots of people I was starting to work with, engineers and people, and architects who wanted to do something about it. So I started to think differently about how do I want to work as a landscape architect. And just going back to that idea that there's the spirit of nature, but also creativity. And one of the first opportunities to test that was this project in Scotland. I worked with an architect called Andrew Wright, who at the time was working with Richard Rogers Partnership. And there was this idea for actually creating a Buddhist retreat on Holy Island, which is just offshore of Scotland. It was for 50 people, and the idea was to, how do we create a system, an architecture, a landscape that could sustain 50 people. And some of those people don't actually, it's absolutely fascinating to talk about on this, but basically, the holier you are, the further up the mountain you go, and you stay there. And there's the guy at the top would probably live on his own in a little building for 20 years. Maybe just come and get his dinner every now and then. So there's a real spiritual and ecological sort of narrative to that. And these are some of the drawings that I produced at that time, which just is part of a sort of sequence, but it was me trying to understand, okay, well, if we're trying to make a landscape that is sustaining a community, what does that do? And so in here you'll see there are diagrams about food production areas and actually understanding how much area we needed for each of the types of food. And the interesting thing was you had flat areas at the bottom where you could grow potatoes, and as you go up the hill, you had to be foraging. So it's really, how do you use the topography? How do you use that topography to manage water? How do you use that topography to sort of create sequential experience as you come up the slopes? You come from the sort of community of lots of people into your own space. So all of those things, and basically I just started to develop this way of drawing as trying to sort of capture that process. And I took that further with the Richard Rogers Partnership, as it was at the time, into this quite significant master plan in Mallorca, where just rather than a little 50 people, this was like sort of 10,000 people, and starting to think about layering landscape diagrams and thinking about food and water and experience and character and all of those sort of things that were basically just the fabric of places, really. So that was developing a sort of an approach, I suppose, the idea of a narrative. Then the first big project we won as a practice, Grant Associates, was the Earth Centre in Conisbrough, which was one of the Millennium projects funded by the National Lottery. So this was great because I got to work with amazing architects. I worked with Will Alsop personally, I worked with Future Systems, Jennifer Cookie, I worked with Fiona Clegg Bradley, Peter Clegg, and a number of other sort of architects who were engaged in this project. So another sort of a step up for me, personally, working with some extraordinarily creative people, and all within the narrative of sustainable development. This is a project which was basically a visitor attraction around the concept of sustainability. Great ideas, wonderful connection of people. It failed miserably as a tourist attraction, but actually this was, the late 90s, all the concepts put together. It was opened in 2000 to the public, and I think it was closed in about 5 years because it just did not get the sort of footfall. But the stories and the experiences that I took from that really have stood me in stead for the rest of my career since then. And here's one of my diagrams from that stage, which is basically just testing water. How do we manage water on this site? So there's lots of discussion today about regenerative design, recycling systems, and all the rest of it. We didn't have that sort of language back then, but this was my interpretation of exactly that. How do we use the resource that we have on this site? And this is water for irrigation, for creating habitat, for creating joyful interventions, and just starting to try and evolve a sort of futuristic, contemporary interpretation of what landscape could be. And this is a photograph from about 5 years ago, I guess. The magic of it for me was that it actually reclaimed what was a derelict coalfield. This was a black, barren landscape. and now it is the most amazingly biodiverse country park. And every day there's 600 school kids that use this site as basically one of those get kids out of the schools for a couple of days and go and experience some teamwork and some landscapes that can work. I told you I was going to be jumping around a bit, but this is a sort of a sequence of things that, from a personal point of view, have been great fun and interesting. And Catherine talked about how do you communicate little ideas and stuff like this. And this was a rubbish sketch, but it actually did a whole lot of stuff for us. This was a British Pavilion garden at the Japan Expo in 2005 in Nagoya. It's a tiny little space outside the British Pavilion, about 80 metres by 12 metres or something like that. And they wanted a British garden. And I thought, no, we don't want to do that. We want to create something different, a bit more rich and ecological. So we proposed a woodland. And it was very interesting. Japan and the UK climate in that particular place is very similar. And I had the idea of creating a lime tree wood. And they had more or less the same form of lime tree, but slightly different species. So we used a series of lime trees, created a garden experience at the ground level, which changed in character over 6 months, and then populated it with amazing pieces of art from leading British artists. So here's some of the earlier sort of little studies, little Photoshop studies of, okay, we can start off with ferns well, we started off with daffodils, and then foxgloves came, and the ferns came. And in amongst of that, there was these amazing, lovely interventions. And that's an image of actually how it was. And it was very popular. It's a great place just to sort of just go and meet people. But once again, it's that sort of magic ingredient of just creating a place that exudes the sense of nature, but actually touches you with art and creativity. So, learning all the way, another project here which was basically a big housing project we did in Bristol Harbourside. This was also sort of late 90s, I guess. One of the big things, this was working with Ted Cullen, an amazing architect, and the mast you see there is SS Great Britain, hidden behind a building, but basically it's this sort of landmark, classic ship that was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And there's a sort of a line, a big axial line, and a walkway that comes all the way from Bristol Temple Meads, eventually ends up here. And this was our little last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, this ramp down to a new harbourside within this sort of new urban master plan. So what could we do to make that more interesting? And the idea was that, we would actually start to tell a story about how we're gathering the water from the buildings either side. We worked with some sculptors who actually expressed the process of water coming off there through the landscape, through a rill, where all those people are sitting on the edge there. They're sitting over a little sort of rill on the side. And so there's a nice understanding of the journey of water through a landscape. And then the character of the landscape, the planting changes through the year. So meadows and the likes. And people start to use it, a really nice place to just stop and have lunch or meet somebody, because you've got that lovely view to the SS Great Britain. It's the integration. All of these things, it's about creating experience, practical places to do things, but also embedding a whole load of other stuff within that, whether it's biodiversity, water management. This is a floating reed bed on the edge of the floating harbour. We were talking about floating reed beds and things earlier on. So this was implemented, and just part of the biodiversity enhancements of this this place. And once again, it's 20 years old now. We've done a lot and lots of residential projects over the years, but probably still my favourite is this one, Accordia in Cambridge, which basically won the Sterling Prize in 2008. And, you know, great architects, Phil and Clegg Bradley Studios, McCrenna Lavington and Alison Brooks. But I had the idea that, you know, let's give it an identity. Living in a garden. We're going to be, you know, using the landscape metaphor, living in a garden as a way to sort of structure this and to create a complete diversity of spaces and experiences that range from just lovely sort of almost shared vegetable plots through to ecological corridors down the brook to nice simple formal lawn areas. And where there would be cars normally and lots of parking, we call them street gardens. All those areas with the orange and the green, they're basically just gardens that people could share either side. Very popular and, you know, really, really successful project, and remains, I think, a great reference for residential developments in the UK. I'm going to flip through because we're arriving in Singapore now. Singapore, I've worked in Singapore now since about 2002, which is a bit scary actually thinking about it. But they've been ahead of the curve in terms of how do we think about the built environment and sustainability, and particularly in terms of greening. Interestingly, they saw landscape as, you know, a core part of their identity and how they could distinguish Singapore as a city-state from Malaysia and other surrounding areas. They wanted to sort of set themselves above it, saying, look, come and do business with us. We know what we're doing. We're really sophisticated. We know that actually creating a great living and working environment for our locals and for visitors and new developers is really what's going to set us apart. And I find that really, really interesting. And since then, they developed a very sophisticated series of planning policies nationwide, and in particular this idea of actually greening buildings. There is a requirement to have a certain percentage of your building has to be planted. Typically, you have to replace the site surface area of your plot with the equivalent or more of green space. And it's led to extraordinary expressions of that. This is the Park Royal by Woha, which is just walk past and go, oh, wow, that's amazing. But it set the scene really for our project, Gardens by the Bay. And this is another one of those sort of turning points in terms of my career, in that we've just had a little practice in Bath. There's about half a dozen of us just doing, well, on the back of Earth Centre and a couple of other projects like Bristol. We've sort of got to be known as people who do slightly more ecologically driven design. So we seem to have got on a list that was sent to the National Parks Board in Singapore, and I got a call saying, can you come and meet us in London? We're doing this competition. And so I went to see them, and on the back of that I put an expression of interest for this project, which was an international competition. I built a team, amazing people, and extraordinarily we got shortlisted. And this was a shortlist which was, you know, there was those Grant Associates with 6-7 people in Bath against Norman Foster, OMA, all these sort of big names that are around the world. And with Wilkinson Air Architects and Atelier 1, Atelier 10, and a whole other UK projects, we basically won the competition to our absolute amazement. But we put a lot of effort into it. We really wanted to sort of test how that would be. And here's some of these diagrams that I think maybe Catherine was talking about. Because I wanted to sort of, how do we build a story about this place? And the orchid is the national flower of Singapore, the most cosmopolitan species on the planet, found everywhere, apart from the polar ice caps and stuff. But I thought it'd be really nice to sort of use that as a metaphor, not necessarily literally trying to sort of build everything as an orchid, but there's something really lovely about the idea that the orchids could become the special gardens, the beautiful bits. The stems could be the the pathways. So you start to create a geometry for how you organize the space. And importantly, the way orchids live, typically they're epiphytic, and they just manage to have the most really interesting physiology. They can live in most extraordinary places just because of the way they can absorb nutrients, how they take water, how they create their own energy, all those sort of things in most hostile places. So we thought, beautiful flowers, intelligent infrastructure, that's basically where we want to go with this. So we came up with some, this is at the competition stage, some ideas that actually we want to explore this as an ecosystem. Quite naively, in many respects, but actually when we started to have conversations with Tully Attend, the engineers in particular, this started to evolve into what became a really very intelligent, sophisticated system, which delivered zero carbon operation costs for the glass houses, which putting air-conditioned glass houses in the tropics is pretty bonkers. But actually, just through some really intelligent, clever design, we got that to work really well. And then actually working back out through the gardens, thinking about the biodiversity, thinking about the water management, thinking about the experiences, it started to work really well. So this is the motley crew that sort of led the garden by the bay. Because all the best projects, there's no doubt about it, involve absolutely bright ideas from really good people. So the guy in the white shirt was Dr. Tan, who was our client. He's still my client today on the same project. And I think that's another one of those things that, I'd encourage you basically just build these relationships with people that will last you through your life. And Paul Baker, the architect behind Dr. Tan, Wilkinson, great friend, still working with him. Patrick Value, one of the most amazing engineers in the world in terms of environmental engineering. Myself, slightly different look. And Neil Thomas, one of the most amazing structural engineers you will ever find as well. And, once again, I've worked with Patrick and Neil since the Earth Centre project. So just having that trust and relationship to deliver amazing projects. I'm going to scan through lots and lots of images now of Gardens by the Bay, just to sort of portray the fact that, this has become an amazing global place. But underneath it is a story about plants. If the big diagram, basically, the red bits are exploring the story of plants and people, the relationship of, cultural relationship of plants and people. I mean, and in Singapore particularly, you have Chinese, Indian, sort of Malay and Western sort of perspectives on what's the significance of plants. So we told all those stories. The green side is very much about the biodiversity of Southeast Asia, the fragile forests, the amazing biodiversity in the flowers and the animals and everything else. We wanted to sort of tell those stories. And then the orange bit in the middle is very much this sort of fusion of human sort of intervention, interests, and nature. How do we create that sort of symbiotic relationship between us? So that was the, in addition to the narrative of the orchid, that sort of structure of the park drove everything. And today, it is the most amazing three-dimensional immersive biodiverse botanic garden, futuristic, that features all sorts of weird and wonderful places. And the super trees in particular, as Catherine said, have been picked out as one of these sort of icons. The design developments of the super trees, I mean, it could take for an hour just talking about them, but at the heart of it is basically how could we use them to create the most spectacular vertical tropical gardens? How can we use them to create shade? How can we use them to create sort of solar power and become biodiversity sort of narratives too? So the design of each piece became a really important sort of jigsaw puzzle. How do we provide a place for plants? And in Singapore, I mean, it's basically very hot and bright during the day usually, and it's much nicer in the evening. So another one of my rubbish sketches, but it was basically trying to say that we want to create two types of experience here. It's not just about the daytime experience and looking at nice plants and colours and things. We want to do something at night which will just be an amazing place to come and visit. So working with lighting designers, this is Karen Mendy from Tokyo. We started to talk about how can we use these structures to just become almost animated devices during the evening. Karen, he talked about them talking to each other with light, which was really sweet and quite nice. And definitely the nighttime experience is something to behold. And the Super Tree Grove there basically becomes, there's absolute every night, there's 3,000 or 4,000 people come here, just because it's free, and it's a sound and light show, and you can just sit there amongst it all and be absolutely blown away by the experience. Most people just lie on the ground and look up. It's really weird. I don't know if you the Tate's modern experience, all of our lives somewhere, we just laid on the floor and looked up. Just do exactly the same. And the magic, why did they do that? I think one is the fact that this is, you're part of it. You're not just, I'm a spectator here and I'm looking at something over there. You're part of it with lots of other people, and you can move around in it. And the scale of it is like, it's enormous. So adding drama into cities is the takeaway I've got from that. How do we create landscape drama and scale and impact and wow moments? We do a lot of nice sort of tidy stuff, but how do we just step it up every now and then and actually make places add identity? This is the cloud forest. It's inside one of the biomes. I forgot to mention there are two biomes. One is cloud forest, which is a tropical montane environment. The other one is more Mediterranean. But at the heart of this one is this sort of huge, big artificial mountain that you go up in lifts up through the middle. Then you can walk down on these ramps, external ramps, area walkways. And at night, it's like, you're just in a different planet, basically, because the misters come on, because they need the humidity, the lights are there. It's like a spacecraft landing. But once again, I mean, it's just a landscape idea. We want to replicate a sort of a tropical mountain, cover it with amazing plants, create a dramatic waterfall, and inside is a series of galleries which can tell you about the ecology and the biodiversity of tropical mountains. And what went with that then is how do we support all of those amazing plants on the skin of this mountain? And if you go there today, it is just this extraordinary super scale collection of plants. And on the top there is the Lost World, which is basically full of pitcher plants. I'm just going to flip through some of these just to give you an idea. The other one, the Flower Dome, is Mediterranean, and they theme that every 6 months or so. This was last year when they had a Monet theme for the garden. Do it really well. And of course there is the fact that this is 54 hectares of green space in the emerging developed world of Singapore, and it's already got extraordinary biodiversity. The smooth-coated otters actually use gardens as their main home when they're not fishing in the marina. And because it's been successful, I mean, basically, Gardens by the Bay gets about 12-13 million visitors a year, and it's growing. And so many people have used the sort of super trees and the landscape references as part of Singapore's identity. Singapore, our city in a garden. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and not only do we have Hello Kitty in Singapore, we now have Mickey Mouse in Singapore, with, using the super trees as a backdrop. So on the back of Singapore Gardens by the Bay, we became known locally in the region. So we then commissioned by the Malaysian government to do a study of Endorompin National Park, which is, a lot. It's a big national park, 80,000 hectares of tropical rainforest, which sustains wild tigers and sunbears and all those sort of things. And just having the opportunity to think ecologically about how do you sustain wildlife of that nature? What do they need? How do we integrate that with improved tourism? How do we manage the resource extraction? So, a strategy was put in place, and basically bit by bit they'll be working through that. In a similar way, back in Singapore, we were invited by the Sentosa Development Corporation to produce a master plan for Sentosa, which is effectively the leisure centre for Singapore. And then Pulau Brani, which is the island in the middle of the image there, you can see there are sort of like cranes around it, around the edge. That at the moment is Singapore's container port. It's the sort of second biggest, most busiest port in the world, and they're moving it because this is prime real estate, and they want to actually make Pulau Brani part of this world-class tourist destination. And as landscape architects, we've been leading that master plan, and it's been great fun. I've had the benefit, not only Singapore, Malaysia, China. I've been working in Australia too. This is in Barangaroo, which is in Sydney. It's a sort of new development. And we just created this place, this cove on the edge of the Darling Harbour, as a place to sort of gather and just one of those placemaking things. Everybody talks about placemaking. So this was just one of those moments where we created the opportunity to have a place that you could just sit down and watch the sunset. A very simple concept, and sit on natural stone, so somehow you're rooted in the place, and just become this beautiful, lovely, simple space. And it's very successful as a place. It sort of builds on Peter Walker's Barangaroo Headland Park. He used the sandstone in a similar way. Jumping about, I told you to be jumping about quite a lot. Coming back to London, we were challenged to come up with a landscape. It's a competition, a concept for the Tower of London moat for the 2022 Queen's Platinum Jubilee. The top right image is basically how it was. It was just basically every year they put little things, events on them, the turf pits. And it had been like that since 1845, when the Duke of Wellington said, the moat needs to be drained. It's too smelly and horrible. So historic royal palaces basically saw that this is a resource that they could use more of as part of the selling and the portrayal of the tower itself. So they commissioned us to come up with what we call the super bloom, which was to fill the moat with flowers for the summer of 22. And it was extraordinary. It's very hot. But by just playing that game we've learned in Singapore, through the day, it's the smell of these flowers, the colours, and at night you just can push it into a slightly different way, a different world. This one has been more recently part of the sort of joy of being a landscape architect. And thinking, did they really build that? So this is in Bangalore. This is Terminal 2, which we worked on with SOM architects. And the client was very clear. They wanted, to go away from this idea that airport terminals have to be these big flashy roofs and all sorts of flowy things. Let's just cut it back to make it a landscape experience. So this is an image in the check-in hall, and where we used landscape devices to create wayfinding, to create identity, and to create, just moments of quite extraordinary scale and amazement. But this is my concept sketch, which is basically saying, well, we're going to wrap this airport terminal in a forest belt, And everybody who goes through this process has to basically, every stage of the journey, whether it's security or baggage or whatever it is a landscape experience. And you'll go through this forest belt to get onto your plane. So there's a whole sequential narrative about how we would manage people, and lots of studies and diagrams went into place. And you can imagine, it's still got usual things, it's still got all the elements, security and duty-free, but we broke all of that up with serious sort of landscape interventions. So just going back from a quick sketch, well, can't we do something like this, please? To, okay, well, let's explore that a bit more, thinking about the lighting with the architects and the engineers, thinking about how we'll make these things, and then actually having them installed. So this is the cue towards the security. You know, just the idea of actually completely changing your perception of what an airport experience is. And using gardens as sort of thresholds between some of these things. So this is one of the gardens that separates security from the duty-free. You're not pulling your trousers up and going straight into buying perfume. You can just calm at the moment. So I'll flip through these. So the retail areas and the lounge areas, all landscape, use of water, a bit of noise, ambience. And it's been really interesting how impactful this has been in Bangalore in particular, because we've now been approached by developers saying, oh, we want to change our retail model into something like this. We want to do something different with our residential development. And this is the forest belt. So this is everybody who arrives or departs has to go through this belt, which is about 60 meters wide, absolutely full of rare species, you know, gathered from the local region. Just jumping around the world, this is in Rwanda, where we've been working with Field Effect Bradley Studios again as master planners on this new master plan for 10,000 homes, basically. Completely fascinating working with some of the local consultants about how to create a cultural relevance for the landscape and the public spaces in this place. And the overall master plan has been signed off, and we're hoping we're going to start sort of more detailed design for phase one shortly. So for the last 3 years, I've been working in Monaco for the government of Monaco, Renaturé la Ville, basically greening the city-state. It's tiny, it's 2 square kilometers. The second densest human population place on the planet. But it's extraordinary. And the challenge for us was to actually twofold. One was to meet the objectives of a biodiversity strategy that they put in place, which was to radically improve the biodiversity within the city-state, and then also to create a much more legible, comfortable public environment, so people would walk around Monaco in the context of climate change, climate mitigation. How do we do these two things where there's no space, basically? It's all just very difficult. And I mean, there's a whole story that goes with it in terms of the evolution, but what's interesting with Monaco, it's been one of those places that people have gravitated to through history because of its climate, because it's a beautiful setting, where the landscape, mountains, the sea, the Mediterranean, the breezes off the sea, all of these things have contributed to it. So 19th century was its heyday probably in that context. We're now in a place, the 21st century, where more people want to live there. 40,000 people a day commute into Monaco from France. It's extraordinary. So this is the sketch that I put together to start to give some sense of this is what we want to do. It's almost like microsurgery to sort of stitch together wildlife corridors alongside improved pedestrian cycle links. I won't go through all of the translation because I can't remember. But anyway, but one of the key things was some of these north-south sort of corridors, which are the old valleys, the vallons, where there's a sense of potentially reconnecting the mountain landscape to the sea through those corridors. So you begin to get that connectivity. And we developed a whole language of nature-based solutions and ecosystem services analysis, and actually started to develop some ideas. Well, actually, we're taking it beyond ideas. We're actually developing proper pieces of infrastructure now. But this was one thought, which was, it's a limestone landscape. So this was just taking the idea that we'll create these, what I call macroliths, and create little micro-habitats on these, depending on where they were in the city, whether they're up at the foresty bits or a park bit or in the sea. And once again, just working with a multidisciplinary team to create something really quite extraordinary. You know, that's one of the things we've been doing. And adapting also applies to lots of the projects we're working on at the moment, which is about rethinking how we use existing buildings. So this is just two examples of recent projects for us. One in Singapore was Grand Hyatt Hotel, one of the big, really nice 1970s, 1980s buildings that were completely revamped. We had knocked it down and made another one. We revamped, and that actually overlaid a whole landscape narrative in here about, you know, well-being. This is a nice place to be. The whole concept of biophilia, all those sort of things. And Mountbatten House in Basingstoke, extraordinary piece of design back in the 70s, 80s. You know, amazing podium gardens, listed, has been brought back to life by a new developer. And we've just basically, that's just been finished. You'll have seen it published in the Architectural Press. What a place to work, just amazing. But once again, this part of the adaptation to the future. So one of the things, I was invited to join the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group, which is a small group, about 12 people, who are sort of advising the National Infrastructure Commission on how to better design infrastructure in the UK. This was the design principles published a couple of years ago, and a site-specific or project-specific guide that's been put together. But interestingly, there are four, you know, climate, people, place, and value are the four very simple principles that every project, whether it's infrastructure or whatever, needs to think about. How do we address climate change? How do we provide the best environment for people? How do we respect the place, the biodiversity, the ecology? And how do we create added value? And it's not just about how much it costs, it's about all the other sort of supplemental things that we work with. And with Bristol Zoo, we're sort of working just because, you know, I thought it would be really nice to do a conservation project. We're working with them on a sort of a field research station in Madagascar, where basically the blue-eyed black lemur, endangered species, is surviving, just about. So how can we help to do that? And in Bath, I'm sort of the chair of the landscape partnership, the Bathscape Landscape Partnership, which is basically looking at how do we sustain, adapt, evolve the landscape setting of this amazing city, which is a World Heritage Site in its own right. So at one level, you've got this amazing capability of brown infrastructure. At the other level, you know, just the usual challenges of cities, whether it's deprived urban neighbourhoods, diminished ecology, inappropriate development, all those sort of things. But it is really interesting because basically the challenge is how do we adapt, change extraordinarily globally significant spaces to be adapted to the future of that city. So this is, you know, we've been doing lots of little studies, but this is one which was Great Pontley Street, you know, 30-metre wide street, just full of cars. How do we put rain gardens and pieces of nature into that? controversial because it's a World Heritage Site. What's the nature of this? But it's exactly what needs to be happening everywhere. How do we adapt our cities and spaces? I'm going to end, I think, with a little film of the other project. For the last 12 years, I've co-founded a project called Forest of Imagination, which every year we do this sort of pop-up in the city with artists, and it's ecology themed. It's how do we link the ecology of the place in a way with the creative ecology of the place. And that was basically we were invited by the National Trust of all people just to take over the assembly rooms, grade 1 listed building, probably a significant building in Bath, and we completely transformed it into this extraordinary playground of exploratory nature, I guess. And we need to do more of that. We need to sort of just change the agenda of how we think about places to bring nature back.
Where are we? What is the time? How far have we wandered? And who will finish our rhymes?
There is this feeling, it's like a rhythm, almost like a piece of music or something that has been put together. So mine is the hurrah as you come in.
How do we represent nature? I mean, there's so many things you could talk about. A story about Bath and its ecology, a story about design and the tension between formality and informality, referencing, nature.
Assembled in the Forest this year as an invitation to the whole community to really think about coming together to explore these important themes around nature, imagination and well-being.
So something that is in your head when you go in, you don't have to know what it means. You just have to go in and wonder.
I mean, it's all layered and it's really hard to explain.
When you come into the room, you just feel in a new place. It's nothing that you would have expected walking into the room. So it's nature out of context.
The messy, beavery world, because they create a mess, basically, beavers, to a large extent. But that mess creates really vibrant habitats for many other species.
You have to get down, you have to crawl, and that's what makes it interesting. Then you're transported into another underworld.
What's our relationship to nature? How does it work in terms of the way we design and create places? We've got that amazing dialogue going on here.
People always think because you have colour, it's for children. I mean, it is just for people and absolutely for every age.
You come in and you have a new horizon line, you have a new perspective on things.
This wonderful opportunity to contrast this absolutely exquisite crystal symmetrical chandelier with something that's wilder.
This represents a 250-year-old beech tree. What we're doing is honoring the life and the time of this tree, which matches the 250 years of the assembly rooms.
What I'd like is people think about their own relationship with nature and, even in a little way, even on a terrace, even on a balcony, you can have that beautiful joy. The bees can come to you if you just you made the effort and put the flowers out there and, the things that they like.
Amazing input from lots of people. An incredible sort of generosity, really, across multiple organisations and individuals to pull it together.
The creative community that comes together to make it happen every year is really special. And you do it because you get to see the schools come in, you get to see the families come in, and you get to see them be transported. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's about the imaginations, how do you get people thinking differently.
So yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly well organised way of doing something and unusual. And so at first it's quite hard to navigate because there's lots of different things going on and you're like, is this all gonna, and then when it comes together you think, wow, that was genius.
We are all connected to the nature, that it's in our DNA, we share this, and when we're in nature, even if we're inside with this nature, there is a connection.
Thank you.
Andrew, that was just brilliant. Thank you so much. Shows how I think there's a perfect integration with ecology and design. They're not separate things. Absolutely need to be integrated. The value of amazing collaboration, interdisciplinary, proper collaboration, where you don't even know which profession others come from, but you just know what they can do and how they can do it. And actually, the value of nature and how important that is. Just think what Birmingham could be like if we had that sort of approach here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's just been an absolute pleasure to have you here. A real honour for you to come up. That's been brilliant.